This is Morbo, the newscaster from Futurama, and you are listening to This Week in Geek with Mike the Birdman Dodd and the rest of the TWIG crew. They are my favorite puny humans, and when my race absorbs and destroys yours, I shall not do it to them personally.
In the great hall of the Justice League.
Out of the sky, his rockets ignite. Jets into battle, flying faster than light. Lord of the jungle, the hero who stalks. The beasts call him brother, the goes to war. Defenders of the earth. Defenders.
Bruce Banner, belted by gamma rays.
Brainiac, what is it?
Look, I just want some pants. A decent pair of pants.
Big man in a suit of armor. Take that off. What are you?
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist.
It's morphin' time!
Put an ad on the front page. Cash money for a picture of Spider-Man. He doesn't want to be famous, and I'll make him infamous.
My spider senses are starting to tingle.
Fabulous secret powers were revealed to me the day I held aloft my magic sword and said,
"It's clobbering time."
Hey guys, this is not Mike Dodd. This is John Todderin from Saskatoon. How y'all doing? And welcome to TWIG Sunday Funnies. This has been something in the planning for a while now. Mike did the first few episodes mainly because I barely know what I'm doing. I mean, I've been podcasting on and off for almost 10 years now. And I had talked to Mike and Alex a while ago, said, I'd love to do something with you guys. I've been listening to you both for years. And Mike said that, we're looking at doing a comic book show. And I was like, I know comic books. So with that, I would like to introduce my semi-permanent co-host, Mike the Birdman Dodd. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing okay. As you may notice, it's only me and JT, as there have been some slight changes with the show. It's going to be me and JT for the most part from here on out. We're going to be inviting Alex on whenever he gets the time, just as he's busy with a lot of the TWIG stuff that I don't know how to do, which is a lot of the TWIG back end. So he's decided to take his leave of absence, but don't worry, I'm sure you will hear him back on the show at some point. But we're gonna open things up and kind of change things up a little bit, because one of the things that me and JT wanted to do is obviously talk comics, but this is sort of taking me to comics university at the same time, because I haven't, as I've mentioned on previous shows, I really haven't been in the comics for quite some time, and JT has been into it, forever. So learning about new things is always exciting, and I'm always wanting to push the boundaries of what I know, expand my pop culture repertoire as much as I possibly can. And today's show was most certainly that.
Yes, and we're going to be... sorry, I didn't mean to step on you there, Mike.
That's okay.
Okay, today's show, originally was going to be a 3-man panel, and we miss you, Alex. You'll always be welcome back. In that respect, he's kind of like Batman in the Justice League cartoon, a part-timer, which is cool. But yeah, Mike and I are going to be talking about some of our favorite comic book teams today. Now, originally, we had selected 2 teams, and just to keep things simple, Mike suggested that maybe do 1 team, because that way we can talk a little bit more about our specific selections, which also opens the door for this to become a recurring series over the course of the show, however long it goes, because there are just so many, gosh darn many comic book teams in the world. And I'm going to let Mike go first today. What was your selection, Mike?
Okay, so this is a team I have had an interest in for a very long time, and I can remember exactly when I got interested in this. For those of you who may be old enough to remember, way back in the 90s, I know in the before time, there was a magazine called Wizard. Wizard was the magazine that would report on comic books and other sorts of other pop culture sort of things. And I remember them showing art for a new thing called Wildstorm, and that was Jim Lee, J. Scott Campbell, and Brandon Choi, I think is his name. And there was a book they were doing called Gen 13, and I was like, okay, this sounds interesting. And then I kind of forgot about it for a couple of years, but I do remember the very striking art of the team leader, Caitlin Fairchild, who's this redheaded powerhouse. Amazon, basically, yeah. She's basically She-Hulk, but not green. And that art stuck with me. But it wasn't until years later that there was a mini series called Roxy Magical Drama Queen, which was kind of like a spin-off as like not even an alternate universe. It was just they took the character of Roxanne Spaulding, Roxy, aka Freefall, and just put her in a weird scenario with her little green pet, Queefling or Queer. What the fuck? Queefling.
No, it's Queelock.
Queelock, not Queef. God, that is an outtake. But anyway.
Oh God, the past of Mike the Birdman Dodd coming back to haunt us in the modern day.
So yeah, so I picked up this 3-issue miniseries and I forgot about it for like a decade or so. And when I pitched the idea to the boys last month, I'm like, you know what? We live in an era of digital comics. JT has everything. And I'm like, dude, hook me up with Gen 13 because I never read the books back in the day. So, my work schedule with TWIG usually takes me away from things. And it took me a little while to get into the books. I've been reading some over the course of the past week. However, I did do a cheat. I cheated. I forgot. I forgot that this even happened. There was a Gen 13 animated movie, and that features Mark Hamill as Threshold, Alicia Witt, who I mostly know her from Mr. Holland's Opus, if I'm not mistaken. She plays Fairchild. Grunge is Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, which it's hard to read the comics in Flea's voice because Flea sounds like such an idiot in the movie.
Yeah, you also know Flea as Nails from Back to the Future.
Yeah, so I was like, okay, fine. And then I forget the woman who voices Roxy, but anyway, so I've got all these characters.
That's Tank Girl, man. That's Lori Petty.
Really?
Yeah, okay. That's Tank Girl.
Oh,
I still have a crush on that woman.
All right. And then they had John Delancey as John Lynch. So I was like, okay, cool. So I watched the movie, and this is neat because it's got a weird bit of history to it. So from what I understand, this was an animated movie that Disney wanted developed, and it's the only DC Disney movie to ever exist. But here's the kicker. It was shelved for however long, and it was put in the fucking vaults. However, it did receive an official release in Russia, parts of Europe, and Australia. So there is a high quality version out on YouTube, and I had to watch it with this annoying as fuck buzzing in it. And the cool thing is the guy who directed it did a lot of stuff for Batman, the animated series, Kevin Altieri, I think his name was. And I was like, I knew this art style looked fucking familiar. And it's sort of a mix between Batman, the animated series, meets Todd McFarlane's Spawn that was on HBO in like 97 to 99, I think. And I was like, yeah. So watching through that, I got a lot more interested in reading, and I started powering through as many of the books as I could before my fucking iPad died because I forgot to plug the son of a bitch in.
To quote Spoonie, betrayal!
Yeah, I was like, God damn it! So what I have read is I've read the initial 5-issue miniseries, and I've read 5 to 6 issues of the second volume of Gen 13, and I like what I've read. Now, I will fully come out and say this right now. This series is 90s as fuck. It does not handle sexuality very well. However, though, one of the characters, Sarah Rainmaker, or just Rainmaker, is bisexual. And I just got into a part where she kisses Bobby, who plays Burnout. And I was like, okay, so they are playing that up. But when she's on the Amazon island, she's looking at all the Amazons and kind of, okay. Plus, she keeps constantly checking out Fairchild and Roxy. And at one point, she's putting suntan lotion on Roxy, and I'm thinking, okay, this is a little weird. And Roxy's like, hey, wait a second. So all right, but I'm getting sidetracked. So for those of you that don't know, from what I understand, JT will correct me as I do this. So this started out as a 5-issue miniseries, obviously to kind of get things going, but it turns out these guys did appear previously, but you didn't get their full appearance till later, till they got their own kind of miniseries.
Yeah, so they kind of built up the initial storyline, that first mini, through issues of believe it was like Stormwatch and Wildcats and a couple of other of the first run Wildstorm titles about this IO in this universe. IO is SHIELD, International Operations. They are, if you thought some of the stuff that Marvel's SHIELD did, IO is like, those guys are fucking amateurs. They went 90s as fuck. They went dark, grim, gritty, and they've got this program where they're collecting these teenagers and putting them in this special research facility / prison to test them to see if they're Gen active. And Gen active is one of several terms, Wildcore, which is an actual comic in Wildstorm, but Gen active is a term in Wildstorm history that is analogous to like mutants or mutation. It's one of several titles they have to describe superhuman powers,
or SPB as they call it in their universe.
Yeah, superpowered beings. I mean, because I think, forget if it's Marvel or DC, actually has like a trade or like a copyright on the term superhuman or superhero or something like that. So if you want to build your own superhero comic universe, you have to come up with your own
term
version.
For them.
Yeah, like Paladin and Overlord or something like that.
Yeah.
So.
But sorry. But say so while like kind of reading this, the setup for Gen 13, the kind of mini series. So it starts out in the first issue where you see some people running away from IO at some point in the late 70s to 80s, and they're just trying to escape. It's this kid named Matthew and this little girl named Nicole, and they get struck down. But before they do, their dad says, take your sister and run. The dad is a former Team 7 operative. Team 7 was Gen 12 guys who were exposed to the Gen active formula, and he got superpowers, but they kill him. So he's like, take your sister, fucking run. Turns out IO captures the kids, and they become bad guys, more or less, throughout the series. But flash forward a number of years later, there's this girl named Caitlin Fairchild. She is a college or university student at Princeton. She's studying computer science. She applies to this thing called Project Genesis, which is supposed to be some kind of a government internship, because she doesn't want to go back to her family in Oregon for the summer. And they say, hey, you're accepted. Here's the thing. You're coming with us right now. She's like, but I have a test. Don't worry about it. We got it covered. So they basically take her in the middle of the night, and she goes to Project Genesis, and she meets up with a bunch of other kids, and they're being trained like it's an ROTC program thing. So it's sort of like a military boot camp, except you also have to do like science classes and all this shit. But you also
like testing your physical and mental thresholds.
Yeah, so it turns out it's run by a woman named Ivana, and she is basically creating her own army of Gen actives for IO. She wants to have all these superpowered beings at her disposal, but this other guy named John Lynch is like, no, Gen actives fucking terrible. I should know. I'm one of them, and they are bad fucking news. Let's not do this. But she's like, John, you're stupid. Don't worry. I got this under control. She doesn't.
I should mention that John Lynch is the Nick Fury of the Wildstorm universe. I mean, he's even missing his left eye. He's got like this scar over it. He doesn't wear an eye patch because that would be trademark infringement. And if you didn't know that Ivana, whose last name is, I think it's Baiul, she is drawn to look like every slinky, slutty James Bond villain. She was Xenia Onatopp before Xenia Onatopp was a thing.
Yeah, that's something we got to talk about before I get any further. Okay, the artwork in this series, it's done by 90s Jim Lee. J. Scott Campbell was a very young artist coming out of this. I think he was like 19 or 20, because you read, and I think it's like Gen 13 issue half, which is like interviews from like Wizard, and there's like a very short story in there too. He's like, yeah, I hired him. He was very, very young. I probably shouldn't have hired him this young because he wasn't ready to handle this much artwork, but whatever. The art looks fucking fantastic. The problem is, holy shit, is this book 90s cheese? Titties, butts, everybody looks like a 90s school pinup. I mean, Caitlin is drawn to be very sexualized, but not in the way she portrays herself, in a sense. Like, she's not, she looks great, but she's very naive as a character. Roxy is very stylish. Rainmaker, it depends. When she gets some of the Coda outfits, it's a little bit wow. But it's very pinup style. Like, you see a lot of curves, a lot of things that, you know, a 12-year-old boy is going to dig. And maybe that's why I dug the series, because it is kind of like that. And I don't like admitting it does appeal to that base desire, but I like the story more than I do anything. And that's another thing too. I'd never seen many Native or First Nations characters, like, because Sarah Rainmaker is a Apache character, and at one point in one of the pre-story, I think it's in issue 0, they go to her reservation where they meet I think it's her Uncle John Two Raven, I think his name is, and she talks about the rain dance and all this crap, and Burnout's kind of making every cultural appropriation joke you can possibly imagine, and it's awkward. But as I said, this is very 90s, so I'm just gonna let it go. But
it's hard to tell people you're fan. I started reading comics in the 90s, and invariably, depending on how old you are in your group of friends, like, I know when some of my friends, I started paying attention in the 90s, like, oh, you just like the tits and ass. And I was like, well, those are nice, but there's no good way to really say that without
looking like some kind of a weirdo.
Especially nowadays, if you say you like stuff like, I know a friend of ours, Mike Blanchard, you know, he's into a few of the Zenoscope titles, and Zenoscope comics are essentially a whole lot of horror story with a whole lot of TNA. But do you really pay attention to the story? Or if you read, I know some friends of mine who are, you know, not necessarily Wiccans, they're into Wicca and all that, and they read Tarot Witch of the Black Rose, which is drawn by Jim Ballant, he of the 90s purple suited Catwoman comic, which was nothing but TNA, because dear Lord, how did that woman walk upright with those boulders on her chest? And the women he draws in that comic, it's like darkness, demons. That chick's got really huge tits. Like, I can't read that comic and pay attention to the story. I'm childish at best. So yeah, these comics, like, the art was, you when you're young, you're more easily able to separate it like that. Like, yeah, redhead's got tits, but then you see the story of these teens in this, basically being abused by this governmental agency, which is being abused by Ivana because she's just doing this because I'm evil and I have plans. And that, so yeah. It was the 90s. I mean, it's a hand wavy thing to say, but it was the 90s.
Yeah, and I don't know. Like I said, I do love the artwork, especially when it is drawn by Jim Lee, but I especially love the J. Scott kind of Campbell stuff. And it's kind of weird looking at Fairchild and looking at a cover that I super love of him that he drew of Mary Jane from Spider-Man. I see a lot of parallels.
Yeah.
But maybe it's just because they're both redheads. I just see a lot of similarities in how the characters look. But anyway, so that aside, eventually Caitlyn's Gen Factor activates after she walks into a thing. She gets sick and she kills a guard by accident because the guard was going to beat up Grunge. His powers haven't manifested, neither has Roxy's, and she's like, what the fuck is this? What is going on? And so anyway, all this happens, and then everybody escapes from this. I forget what the place was even called, but so they escape from Project Genesis with 3 others. They escape with Burnout, whose name is Matt. No, is it Matt?
No, Bobby's Burnout.
Bobby.
Matt is Threshold.
That's right. So Threshold's with them, which they don't know that he's a bad guy, and they escape with like Rainmaker. So this was kind of orchestrated to combat test them to see if their powers would activate. So for those of you that are keeping score at home, so Caitlyn's powers have activated. She is basically super strong, super agile, endurance. She's basically She-Hulk is a good way to describe her. And
her
she's
transformation was a She-Hulk. I would say homage, not ripoff.
Yeah, although in the Gen 13 movie, it's a lot more graphic, obviously, than what you can get away with in comics. So I was like, okay, that's a thing. And they all escape. They get into the desert, and then Threshold turns on them and says, "Ha! It was part of my plan all along." And then it's them escaping, but then through all this, their other powers start to activate because Threshold takes Grunge and Roxy back to base, and Grunge's powers activate where he can molecularly take on the properties of whatever he touches. So if he touches titanium, he's suddenly made out of titanium. If he touches some exotic metal, same thing. But he can also do cool things. If he touches water, he can take on the properties of that and drown you in it, for example. Roxy has the power to manipulate gravity when her powers activate, which means she can float and fly, but if she wants to stick you to the floor, she can do that. But another cool thing, they don't explore it in the issues I've read, but they do talk about it later. Because gravity is technically related to space-time, in theory, she could control time travel. In theory. And I think that's maybe how they explain things later. But so eventually they escape with John Lynch's help, because he's like, I know what these kids are going to be put into. I know what's going to happen. I got to get these kids out of here. So they escape, and he's like, you're going to be on the run for the rest of your lives. IO doesn't let people go. So we're going to work together. I'll keep you safe as long as I possibly can. You're going to use your powers for good.
So yeah, they escape Project Project Genesis with Mr. Lynch. And at first they go out and live the life of luxury in this like seaside villa condo in La Jolla, California, which at first I thought was a made up name. It's an actual place in California. It's where I believe the original studio for Wildstorm was located. I might be wrong about that. And they go off, Gen 13 goes off and has all sorts of wild and crazy adventures. Should mention Burnout, if you can't tell by the name, he's essentially Johnny Storm, although not nearly as powerful. Rainmaker has the powers of Storm, which is weather manipulation.
Although, one of the things I did notice about Rainmaker is she has to have a technological assist, at least in the books that I read. She has amp bands, which amplify her lightning abilities, because otherwise it hurts, but it isn't going to knock you out. When she has the amp bands on, she can do some real damage.
Yeah, and which is something I forget who created the character of Quake in Marvel Comics, and it's something they had in the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. TV show. that Daisy Johnson, aka Quake, she of the vibrational superpowers, she has to wear these gauntlets which kind of tamp down her powers and allow her to focus them so they affect everything else other than her, which is something they dealt with in the show, that every time she used her powers, she was injuring herself. So yes, Rainmaker had that. Mr. Lynch being Gen 12, spoilers, he's Bobby's father.
Dun, dun, dun!
Yeah, that's something, like Mike mentioned the Gen 12s earlier. Yeah, that's not just hyperbole. That's like you find out Wolverine isn't Weapon X, he's Weapon 10. And he was the 10th iteration of the Super Soldier program after Captain America, because they just kept that ball rolling in the background. So after 11 tries before the Gen 12s, who were originally a bunch of these guys, there's also Grifter from Wildcats, Colonel Dane from Wetworks, and they're in Team 7, which was like this super duper Delta Force SEAL 6, we can kick anyone's ass sort of. They were 90s AF super soldier sort of thing. They all get superpowers. Mr. Lynch has this kind of telepathy, mental domination kind of power. And yeah, they go off, just try to live their lives. And yeah, a lot of these things, sexually inappropriate material. They find Caitlin's father at one point, Alex Fairchild, who has some sort of energy manipulation ability. And they get drawn into all sorts of wacky crossovers with the rest of the Wildstorm universe. As Mike said, along the way, they have to deal with interdimensional bad guys, where Roxy gets Queelock, her little green cat monkey thing, which is... Okay, if you haven't figured it out by now, folks, Gen 13, also Wildcats, which is the title I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes here, because not Brandon Choi, but Mark Silvestri, who created Cyberforce, and Jim Lee, who worked on X-Men, like their original creations in Wildstorm are heavily influenced by X-Men. So much so that Queelock is essentially Lockheed the Dragon, except not a dragon. And they, Mike had spoken off air, there are several volumes of Gen 13 comics following the Volume 1, the miniseries, and Volume 2, that first ongoing. The third volume, after the series had come to a close, and I forget, what was that, 75 issues?
75 or 80, I think so.
Yeah. Well, it's like 75 regular, like the ongoing, and then annuals and spin-offs and all that. Also, along the way, Gen 13 comes into conflict with Ivana's new team of Gen Actives called the DV8, which is they're just evil and super violent and emo as fuck. This title is canceled. Gen 13 Volume 3 comes out post 9/11, and it is heavily influenced by, it's set in an alternate world. 9/11 happens. Two of the main characters in this new team are these set of twin boys, and they were working. There was a backstory with this kind of reinvention of Wildstorm, in that there was this mysterious being going out and randomly giving people superpowers, and the deal was going to come due when they turned 21. And they never finished that storyline at all. Like, it ran for maybe a couple of years across a couple of titles and just petered right out. But you have this new crew of kids going to this, PS 181 in New York City, and one of their teachers is Caitlin Fairchild. And everyone at the time, I remember reading in Wizard, like, the fuck? And it turns out that after the end of their ongoing series, but before this one, the Gen 13 were dealing with a bad guy and had this super powerful bomb that somehow ripped a hole in space-time and shunted Caitlin's soul into this other world, because slowly she started to remember her other team. And by the end of it, time travel shenanigans ensue, and she leaves that world and gets back together with the original team, and the other kids go off and are never heard from again. Volume 4 is not, it is and it isn't a soft reboot of the Gen 13 concept. And it came at a time when eventually Jim Lee sold Wildstorm Comics to DC, and it became kind of how Vertigo used to be, like how Swamp Thing and Hellblazer were off in their own world and they weren't connected to DC Comics anymore. It was its own separate world, just DC owned them. And they did this thing called Worldstorm. It started as kind of an anniversary celebration of all things Wildstorm. Like, you remember, did you ever read The Authority, Mike?
I didn't, but I know of them because they were mentioned in the Wildcats Aliens crossover, but I don't know much about them, though. I know they're like a super powerful government super team, though.
Well, not so much government. They step in because, the governments of the world. It was written by, Warren Ellis and then Garth Ennis, and they both went with the tack that the world's governments are just in it for themselves and they don't care a whit about us, the regular people. And that's a whole episode in and of itself. But essentially, starting with some elements in the Authority, they built towards this thing called the Worldstorm, where the world came to an end. There was this huge kind of apocalyptic disaster involving some super powerful SPBs from Wildstorm history. And just before this, they started the Gen 13 comic where you get these new versions of Caitlin and Roxy, and you find out that Grunge's real name is Percival Edmund Chang, which it always makes me stick with the things. This guy who's like the dudest bro that ever duded broed. And we should mention Grunge's costume was the requisite red spandex pants, these ribbons wrapped around his forearms like fighter wraps, and he's got this huge winged skull tattoo in his chest. That's it. Gonna let that marinate for a second there. And you find out over the course of this Gen 13 series is at some point the original Gen 13 team was killed. And the Doctor, who is the Sorcerer Supreme of the Wildstorm universe, he's the world shaman, collects their souls and helps them migrate into these new clones based on the original Gen 13 team. And they go off and have the requisite Gen 13 brand of wacky adventures. And at one point, they're escaping from Tabula Rasa, which is the new Project Genesis thing they're escaping from. They run through a teleporter in the back of this van, and then when they come out, it's 6 months later, and they have missed they've missed the apocalypse, and now the world is just incredibly messed up, and they go off into the wasteland and try and find their way, eventually hooking up with the remnants of Stormwatch and Wildcats and the Authority to try and fix the world. And by the end of that series, they have brought the Wildstorm universe to a conclusion. Now, after this, it was, I think, only a year or two after the New 52 happened, and because Jim Lee is firmly entrenched at DC Comics at this point, they folded a lot of Wildstorm characters and situations into DC Comics proper, which is why in the first couple of years of the Superman comic, you see him fighting the villain Hellspawn from Wildcats. Caitlin is a recurring character in the Superboy comic, eventually becoming the leader of this team called the Ravagers, and honestly, I couldn't explain that comic if I tried, so I'm just going to pause it there. But yeah, Gen 13's a great comic. If we say it's 90s, but that is not a detriment. Yes, there is saucy art in there, and that's great. Just remember, don't let your thoughts go down that dark road too much, guys, and I mean guys, because you're about 30 or 40 years old now, and we're looking at, not legal age women.
Caitlin's 18 because she was at Princeton, but yeah,
there's a certain level of ick there when if you're reading it now and you're just like, wow, that redhead. Oh wait, shit, my daughter's that age.
I can say she's pretty.
Yes.
But like, if you like a different flavor of X-Men Light, this isn't bad. I was surprised how much I enjoyed it. Plus, it was neat in the books that I read when they went to that island of mystery, which that name alone is fucking stupid. But they go to it, and it's this land of Amazons, and it's Dakota. And I'm like, isn't that chick from Wildcats Dakota? And surprise, she fucking is. So I was like, that's really fucking cool. And it's neat to get into a new universe, because one of the things I've discovered by doing this podcast is I am learning so much. Like last time I talked about Archer and Armstrong, and I really enjoyed that. And that's something I didn't expect to enjoy, because I think people, all they want to do is read Marvel and DC. They don't give anything else a shot. So knowing that these characters have lived on, maybe I can start to reconnect with Fairchild and what's left of Gen 13. As you mentioned, this Ravagers book, if it's interesting, if it's even still going.
No, it ran in the New 52 era, which is, I want to say, it started in 11, so pre 2016, 2017, but it only ran like a dozen or so issues. You know, it's entertaining if you get into it, but you know, they haven't really done anything with a lot of the characters in there once the series ended. In fact, the only character that's really carried forward, Ravagers was the first introduction of Rose Wilson, aka the Ravager, aka Deathstroke's illegitimate daughter, and she's since come into the DC Comics proper, mainly in the Deathstroke titles. But that's really the only characters that's coming forward. There is stuff, rumors about Wildstorm going forward, but you know, once they get to the end of my Wildcats bit, I'll be bringing that back up. So don't worry, folks.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I was really pleased with like what I've read. I really enjoy the artwork that I saw. And like I said, it's cool seeing early Jim Lee, early J. Scott Campbell. It's cool. Plus seeing a bisexual character, which admittedly they didn't handle the sexuality great, but it was different. The fact that she's native is very cool. It's nice to see some representation in there, and it wasn't played over the top. Yeah, she went back to her reservation, and yeah, they did a rain dance, but I'm willing to let that go because you don't see it often. Because I'm trying to think of native characters. There's Warpath from Marvel. Who else is there? There's got to be a lot more. There's that other superhero who's from the Yukon in Marvel, whose name escapes me.
Well, there's Shaman from Marvel's Alpha Flight.
Yep.
There's
that's so. Ugh.
Well, yeah. I mean, I haven't.
It bothers me only because it's so on the nose. I mean, it could only
has an infinite medicine bag.
Yeah, I mean, the only way they could have made it worse is if they called him, "This is Medicine Man. He smoke him the peace pipe." That's the only way they could have made that more racist. But you know what? I'm willing to let it go. As a First Natives guy, party on. I'm glad there's something there.
Yeah, Shaman, the original Thunderbird, who died in like his second
appearance. Yeah, he blew up or something.
Yeah, then Thunderbird 2/Warpath from X-Force. And there's a character I know came out in like late 60s, early 70s called Red Wolf, who, you know, he had like this Red Wolf pelt, like, I don't know if it was the actual skull of a wolf, but his mask was like, you know, the skin and the nose and everything from a wolf, and he had like the fur with the paw and the claws dangling over his chest, and he had like a Forge, yes.
Thought so.
Although
he was cool.
Yeah, no, although I debating whether or not he was still native when they brought him into X-Men Evolution, where they basically turned him into Fez.
What?
Oh, we'll talk about that off mic. That's just a sidebar we'll never come back from. So feel you're good up on Gen 13 there, Mike?
I think so. I mean, honestly, if you can find a way to read this series, I really think you should. If you can find a way to watch the Gen 13 movie, like I said, you can buy the movie officially from Russia, though there are places in Europe you can get it. There is a version on YouTube. It is worth a watch. It's amusing to hear Mark Hamill as Threshold. And one more sidebar on this. I decided to go looking for Gen 13 merchandise. There isn't a whole hell of a lot. I did find some action figures. There's one of Rainmaker. There is one, I think there's a grunge one. There's a couple of different Fairchilds. None of them are particularly great. I'm actually really surprised there isn't a DC Direct version of her, because she is such a she is, for lack of a better description, she is such a statue-esque character. And I did find a model kit that came out in the late 90s, and it is worth like $600. I am not. Yeah, like that is Gentle Giant sideshow territory, and it is nice, but it's a model kit. Get
of what?
Fucked. Of her holding up like a piece of rock or something. I mean, it looks cool, but it's a model kit. Get fucked. If this was a sideshow piece, maybe I'd consider it. If it was Gentle Giant, I'd consider it, but not at that price point and not for what it is. So
yeah, because the only Gen 13 merchandise I have ever seen in the wild, outside of stuff in like Toy Fair, and can we just have a moment of silence for Toy Fair and Wizard Magazine? Because dear God, I miss those periodicals so much.
Let me ask you this, JT, because you seem to have everything, much like Alex, who can find anything anywhere at any time.
Yeah.
Does there exist digital versions of these magazines?
No, Mike. No digital versions exist of Wizard Magazine, and I certainly don't have access to them. Ha, ha, ha.
Good. Because I would love to talk about that. Maybe next month, actually.
Future
we'll talk
topic.
about Toy. Yeah, because
but
such a good thing.
But I was just saying that the only physical piece of Gen 13 merchandise I have ever seen, aside from comics, is at my local comic book store here in Saskatoon, 8th Street Books and Comics. There is a sun-bleached, because it was in the front window of the store for years, sun-bleached blocks of a 12-inch John Lynch figure.
Is he still there?
He's still there. I have no idea how much it costs, but I'm kind of...
Take a picture of that. Post that on Facebook. I'm really curious to see this.
Yeah. And it's, I think it's on the shelf next to a $200 90s, like, Dan Ketch Ghost Rider model of him, like, coming down on some fool with his bike, you know. But yeah, so that's Gen 13, folks. My choice for one of my favorite teams also comes from the Wildstorm universe, the Wild Covert Action Team, the Wildcats. Now, roll with me back to the 90s for a minute. I'm a young boy growing up in farm country Saskatchewan. My only access to comics is, I think I've mentioned in like the first episode of the show, or zero issue, if you will. I used to get comics from a local grocery store. I don't know how they got away with this. They'd ripped the front half of the cover was ripped off. There's like 20 or 25 comics bundled together with string, and they were sold for like $2.50, $3 a pop. At a time when comic books were still like $1.25, $1.50, that's a whole lot of shit given away for pretty well free when you think about it. And this is how I got my interest to all sorts of different comics, Dark Horse, Marvel, DC, what have you. But my first Wildcats comic, is the third issue of the original series. The team is fighting the villain Hellspawn, who looks like this. His head looks like he's got 90s Wolverine hair, but with Ghost Rider's flames, and he's got like a cyborg armored body, declaring victory over the Wildcats. Now, to quick recap of the Wildcats story, the Wildcats are a composite team of Carabim warriors, which are this ancient race of warriors that were warring with the Daemonites, which is, requisite good versus evil, crash land on Earth thousands of years ago, mingle and interbreed with the human population, so much so in the modern day, this High Lord of the Carabim, Jacob Marlowe, has become like richer than rich, so fuck you, Trump. Forms this team of Carabim warriors, half-breeds like Maul and Warblade. Maul is this guy, he's a archaeologist, researcher, skinny little dude who turns into something half the size of Galactus. Warblade is this guy that can like more parts of his body into metal blades, and he gets real stabby. There is Zealot, who is one of the original leaders of the Coda, which is, imagine Wonder Woman's Amazon warriors by way of an Assassin's Creed, because the Coda are essentially just the best assassins in the world. There is Voodoo, who can see Damonites in disguise, and she's also a former stripper. I've got Mike's attention already.
Yep. Plus, she looked cool.
Oh, yeah. And there's Grifter, who he's a former member of Team 7. He doesn't have any kids, thank God, and he's one of the characters in the Wildcats looks 90s AF, because he's got like this big green duster trench coat thing, bandoliers over his chest. He's always got these 2 laser pistols that he's blowing everything up. And he's got one of those bandana masks that just falls over his face and never seems to mess up his vision.
He's ready for COVID. He's got a mask.
Yeah. I don't know how much longer he's got, because this dude is like a 50-pack a day smoker. So yeah, the Damonites are only brought to the attention of the government, specifically IO, because Dan Quayle, Vice President Dan Quayle, was possessed by a Damonite.
If there's any way to date your fucking comics, it's to use modern politicians or modern trends. Like, this problem ran into Gen 13 a lot. There was one panel, and I'll never fucking forget this. That guy's got a cool Soundgarden shirt. I'm cooler than Madonna. Oh my God. And they used so much slang from fucking Wayne's World. But anyway, Dan fucking Quayle.
Yes, and it literally, the first arc, that first 3 issues ends with John Lynch running by like, Wuxtree, read all about it, kind of Jimmy Olsen knockoff, hawking a paper on the street, and he's like, Dan Quayle possessed by alien, and he kind of was like, wouldn't have believed you if you had told me. And that's reference to having run into Grifter in an earlier issue. So yeah, the Wildcats, for the first 1.5 to 2 years, they really stick to this whole, they're fighting against the Damonites, trying to prevent them from coming to power on Earth. And then they have one of the first company-wide crossovers called Wildstorm Rising, which at the end of it, the original team is thought dead in an explosion because they find an ancient Caribbean spaceship that was buried on Earth. This stuff is littered like cigarette butts all over the planet, and they take it into space, and there's an explosion, and everyone thinks they're dead. What goes on from there is this character named Mr. Majestic shows up, and he is a High Lord of the Caribbean. He is Superman, but with even less morals. Mr. Majestic forms a new Wildcats with forget who this. There's this character, she's like Savant, is basically another Caribbean. She has 7 league boots. She's like Laura Croft, but with all sorts of cool magic gizmos. You have Code Red, who is Grifter's younger brother, who's like a former undercover FBI agent. You have Ladytron, who is this spree killer a la Juliette Lewis in Natural Born Killers, except she's been turned into a cyborg. And this guy named Tau, who stands for Tactically Augmented Organism, and they start waging war and just basically street-level crime, occasionally run into some former Wildcats villains. And then it turns out that Tau is actually some sort of sociopathic supervillain who's like trying to manipulate everyone to achieve some mysterious plan that you literally don't figure out what he's trying to do until like 15 years later in the comics. This is fact. What happens to the original team, they have somehow miraculously been warped to the planet Kara, which is the home world of the Caribbean. And they find out not only has the war been over for thousands of years, the Caribbean won or have now like beaten the Damonites into submission. And you find out that the Caribbean weren't any better than anything else. In fact, they are as racist AF as any space race Nazis has ever been. Yeah, well, not quite. It's just like they're just the little people, like just that really smug, aristocratic, you have like the Titanthropes, which is the race that Maul comes from, that they're just basically worker class beasts of burden. And Zealot and Marlowe basically just drink the Kool-Aid and they take to their positions of power. Spartan, it's revealed that, he's a cyborg who's fallen in love with voodoo, and that he basically gets reprogrammed, and it's just like when they reprogrammed the Vision in the Avengers back in the 80s, and he loses all his memories and emotions for a time. And eventually they get back to Earth and reconnect with the second team, and it goes on from there. Now, I highly recommend folks read the original Volume 1 of Wildcats. It ran for about 50-ish issues. There's some side mini-series and other one-shots that, if you can figure out the right reading order, and believe me, I'm working on that because that's kind of my side project right now is figuring out precise reading orders for certain comics. Honestly, just read whatever you can from Wildstorm, really. But the first volume of Wildcats, the second, or somewhere towards the end of the first volume into the second, Alan Moore, he of Watchmen, V for Vendetta, Alan Moore, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Alan Moore, came on and was writing this title for some time. And volume 2 and 3 get really into this Halo brand, or Halo Core, which is the company Marlowe started to kind of be the financial backers for the Wildcats, gets rebranded. Spartan takes it over. He becomes Jacob Marlowe 2, is like the nephew of the original Jacob Marlowe. And they try to, keep dealing with like the Damonites still on Earth, trying to cause shit, and becomes a whole lot more about corporate intrigue and a real kind of spy thriller kind of aesthetic, which I wasn't really a fan of, especially in the third volume. And then there's a one-issue volume 4, which was the kickoff to this Worldstorm event that led to the Apocalypse, where Jim Lee came back to draw, and was written by Grant Morrison. And it was going to be like this reinvigoration and the greatest hits of the Wildcats. And then they blew everything up. And the fifth volume of Wildcats is just firmly entrenched in the Apocalypse storyline. Now, I've almost got the Apocalypse storyline figured out as far as a reading order. So if you ever want to take a crack at that in the future, Mike, let me know.
I'm scared.
You should be. No, what I should say is, now I've rambled enough about the story. What I loved about the Wildcats was, again, heavily influenced by Jim Lee's time on X-Men. And that's the thing I loved about that original lineup, and what kind of hooked me into this story is you've got this hodgepodge team of, you got Spartan, who's, like I said, a cyborg superhero, Grifter, who's this badass gunsmith with some sort of, he's got telekinetic and telepathic powers due to his exposure to the, I believe it's called the Gen Factor, is what creates Gen Actives. So, he's got powers like that. Zealot is an assassin Amazon who also has something of a sexual history with Grifter, and eventually they break up. And one of the things that a lot of writers hooked on to explain why she became such a stone cold bitch. Voodoo, telepath, can see Damonites hiding in disguise because she's half Damonite, half Cherubim. Maul's the giant guy, Warblade with the knife fingers, Void, who is this living supercomputer that's possessed a Russian cosmonaut. Yes,
Okay.
That's exactly what I said. And Jacob Marlowe, or Lord Emp, who's this little person, but he has phenomenal cosmic powers. And it's just something about that 90s AF, before we were saying 90s AF, when I was a kid, that I just glommed onto that, and even the later team. And this is like more adult superhero-ish comics without it being what the later volumes of Wildcats became, where it became more corporate intrigue and mature and stuff that I just really don't care for. Also, this gave us one of my favorite cartoons from when I was a child, the Wildcats animated series.
Which I'm honestly surprised we didn't get more adaptations, because if Wildcats had continued further on beyond its initial, how many episodes was it? 13?
Yeah, it was just 13 episodes. It was the same. It showed up on the USA Cartoon Express alongside the Savage Dragon animated series, which I think might have run 2 seasons. I'd have to look into that. And there were I seem
to remember, wasn't Wildcats CBS though?
It started on CBS.
I thought so.
But I came to know it on the USA Cartoon Express. Now, granted, this is the early to mid 90s, so they might have had a syndication deal or something going on.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, when you talk about, you have the Gen 13 animated thing, there's a Rob Liefeld's Youngblood. If you look on YouTube, you can find the animated trailer, because that was supposed to be a thing. And Mark Silvestri's Cyberforce was almost animated, except it never got beyond the planning stages. But I'm pretty sure if you look somewhere, you can find like the character mock-ups and the production material. So yeah, I love Wildside. There's even a Super Nintendo game that I remember playing. I kicked my ass, but it is what it is. Now, Wildcats was something I remember writing a list when the New 52 came out about all the Wildstorm characters. Like there was a Stormwatch series that ran for about 30 issues. They were called Stormwatch, and they were this secret Illuminati-esque society that protected the world from evil. But it was basically the Authority before they really had the rights to other characters, because I think Grant Morrison had some control over, or Warren Ellis had some control over the characters he created for the Authority, so they couldn't use those right away. You had Caitlin and Warblade and a couple other characters in the Ravagers, and I thought for sure they were bringing the Wildcats back. And they didn't until a couple of years ago, where Warren Ellis wrote this series called The Wildstorm, where he was reinventing the Wildstorm universe, its own separate reality from DC, and they were going to go from there. And they had the Wildstorm. It had a whole bunch of different stuff from across Wildstorm history: Gen 13, Stormwatch, Wetworks, which is a team of super soldiers covered in golden symbiotic armor that fought vampires and werewolves. The 90s. No, I'm not kidding. Wetworks is literally Colonel Dane, who was a member of Team 7, so he's Gen active, becomes the leader of another version of Team 7. They're sent on a suicide mission by their leader. They find these golden symbiotes, like think Venom, that bond with each soldier and give them this golden armor, but also starts mutating them and giving them all like different superpowers. And they fight a secret covert war, because everything was a covert war in the 90s, against the Vampire Nation and the Were tribes. And then Warren Ellis was going to write a new ongoing Wildcats title set in this universe. It was supposed to start last fall. That got put in the back burner, and then it got pulled entirely because apparently the Me Too movement is still alive, and Warren Ellis is a huge fucking creep.
It's unfortunate.
I know.
Hey, if you're a piece of shit, you're a piece of shit. So
yeah, and a friend of mine said, you can learn to separate the art from the artist, and to some point that's true. It's just I've been reading Warren Ellis's stuff for over 20 years, and it's
obvious.
It's not obvious. It's just I haven't been able to separate the art from the artist yet, which makes it hard for me to read anything of his now.
I've had a friend of mine kind of give me a very brief on Warren Ellis, and I'm thinking, yeah, well, there's a guy I don't need to read, which is unfortunate because I hear some of his stuff was quite good, but hey.
Transmetropolitan. Transmetropolitan is a story of this guy named Spider Jerusalem. He's a journalist in the future. The future is very much, it's Blade Runner, and Spider Jerusalem is Hunter S. Thompson.
Okay.
Yeah. Wildcats, I love the World's End, Worldstorm, Armageddon storyline. One of the reasons I love that was the world came to an end. Like, the world is irrevocably fucked up. It's not like Marvel and DC where they have an apocalypse story and then time travel fixes everything. The world was fucked up. It stayed fucked up. And then the heroes make a solid go of rebuilding the world, which I think is something Marvel and DC would never do, because who wants to read a comic book set in the apocalypse? Okay, you can all put your hands down. I know you want to read the comic book of the apocalypse.
Okay, so I'm clear. So this world-ending event, it ends the Wildstorm universe as we know it, and then they folded these characters into mainstream DC?
Yeah, like the characters are still alive at the end of the storyline. It's just the world looks like it had an incredibly bad weekend, and now the Wildcats and Stormwatch and everybody are all working together to rebuild society. And that was how they brought it to an end. And like I said, DC offered Jim Lee a job as, an editorial, and he got a lot of power, and he's like, basically, what's your want? And he's like, he wants part of the deal. They bought Wildstorm, and they started work on this plan to fold these characters in with the new 52. Because did you ever read the Flashpoint miniseries, Mike?
I've only ever seen the DC movie.
Okay. In the end, final issue, as Barry is going back in time to stop himself from preventing his mother's murder at the hand of Professor Zoom, there's this character named Pandora who uses that moment to reunify the three parts that were once whole. And you see this blurb of the Wildstorm characters like the Authority and some Wildcats, and you see the Vertigo with like Constantine and Swamp Thing and a couple other characters, and you see the DC characters. And then the next panel, you see a conglomeration with their going forward their at the time New 52 designs, like how Batman and Superman and Flash and even Green Lantern looked like they had some sort of skin tight armored suits on, because panel lines make everything cool. And they folded it in like that, and never mind story-wise, just over time, the Wildstorm characters were less and less of an issue, and they were quietly let out to pasture. And then they had the Warren Ellis thing, and now going forward, there are rumors that the Wildstorm characters are going to be brought back, because in the future, I think it's issue 105 of Batman, because they're currently doing the Joker War storyline, which is going to cap at Batman 100. Batman is going to end up fighting Grifter, who is now in the employ of Lucius Fox.
Okay.
And it's full-on Coal Cash Grifter, he of the bandana mask, bandoliers, and guns. So going forward, it is my hope, like DC had that plan to do something with the Wildstorm characters. They own these characters. They know there is a huge fan base and a lot of potential with these characters. We'll see what happens going forward, because after the whole Warren Ellis debacle, who knows what's going on.
Yeah, I'd like to see the Wildstorm characters come back. It's pretty obvious from this episode. I love Gen 13. I really do. I want to see these characters come back. Wildcats, I've watched the television series. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Actually, while you were talking there, I decided to take a look on eBay. These guys had a lot of action figures. Some of them kind of cool looking, some of them not so cool looking, but all relatively affordable, which actually kind of surprises me. I actually looked at a Voodoo figure, a couple of Grifter ones that look kind of nice. But they're all relatively about $20, $25 a piece plus shipping. That's not bad, especially for like older figures. So if you wanted to get a complete line, you could get this complete line for, my guess is under $500, which is really, really good. Because I guess the line's just not worth much. But that aside, the character aesthetics I've liked. My favorite characters from Wildcats, probably Voodoo and Grifter. I like Zealot because she's cool, and I really got attached to these characters from the television series, but also from the only Wildcats comic I ever read was Wildcats Aliens, which killed Stormwatch, which is still one of my favorite comics of all time. Because 90s or whatever the fuck had happened. Because it was neat seeing Fahrenheit's guts ripped out. But
the Wildcats Aliens had that one thing. I don't know if we mentioned it when we talked about crossovers. The Xenomorph's ability to adopt genetics from their hosts.
Yes, especially where you see Fahrenheit gets her guts ripped out and the aliens breathing fire down a corridor. Yeah. I was like, that's cool. And that probably helped inspire more of the love of the Aliens franchise, was reading that particular book. So I'm hoping Wildstorm finds a way to live on in some capacity. Fuck, this episode should almost just be called Why We Love Wildstorm. Because I didn't expect this to come out as loving as it did. I mean, I guess in our closing thoughts here, my advice is going to be check out both these titles. They're not hard to find.
Yeah. And definitely the first 2 volumes of Gen 13, I'm pretty sure you can find them on Comixology, or if you can find the physical trades. I always hype the physical trades because nothing... I quote our departed Generalissimo Stan Lee, says, "Comics are like boobs. They look great in a computer screen, but I'd prefer to hold one in my hand."
Oh, dear. Yeah,
God bless you, Stanley.
Ultimately, check both these books out. I mean, there's some great storylines here. There's some fantastic artwork. And if you want to do something even for fun, I decided to do this. Look up cosplay from both of these titles. There are some fantastic cosplayers who've done this, or there's people that have done some fantastic artwork from these. I mean, like I said, obviously Jim Lee is a prolific artist working on both of these titles. J. Scott Campbell, it's amazing how much of his stuff I've dug over the years and didn't know that's him until recently. So I always learn something new on TWIG Sunday Funnies. So I am appreciative AF. So what do we want to talk about next month, JT, since it's just going to be you and I?
Well, I know I suggested speaking about the Justice League, because that was my other team I had picked. And I don't know, do you feel comfortable talking about those punks?
You know what? If I read a couple of their more famous trades, yes, because the point of TWIG Sunday Funnies for me, I want to learn more. So I'm always willing to learn. So we will talk about the Justice League next month here on TWIG Sunday Funnies. And then in October, we're going to be talking about horror comics. Could be Tales from the Crypt. It could be Hellblazer. Could be
Ghost Rider.
Could be anything. And I think Alex wants in on that show. So what we're going to talk about, you'll have to stay tuned to find out. So until next time, folks, the issue has been sold out at the newsstands. I've been Mike the Birdman, joined with
JT from Saskatoon.
And we'll catch you guys in the funny pages. We'll see you guys next time right here on ThisWeekInGeek.net.
Well, that's our show. All right, here's the deal. Every time you watch my show, I will send you $40.
Checks will not be honored.
You've been listening to This Week in Geek, your source for guaranteed nonsense or your money back. Tune in next week for more info on the most important things you didn't need to know. Check out our website at ThisWeekInGeek.net and subscribe to our podcast through iTunes or any podcatcher. If you'd like to comment on this episode, head over to this episode's post at ThisWeekInGeek.net and leave a comment through Facebook Connect. Follow us on Twitter at ThisWeekInGeek.net and follow our Instagram at twig_official_podcast. Social media not your thing? Send us an email at feedback@ThisWeekInGeek.net. We'll see you next time, and remember,
lower your shields and surrender your listenership.
Just when you think this show is terrible, something wonderful happens.
What?
It ends.
I have to go. Somewhere there is a crime happening.